What if states had way more power? Like, imagine California or Texas could just set their own economic policies or even their own foreign policy. It sounds kind of crazy, right? But that's the kind of radical idea we're diving into today. We're doing a deep dive into this 1974 speech by M. Karunanidhi. He was the chief minister of Tamil Nadu at the time, and he was a huge advocate for giving more power to states, to individual states within India. And this speech, well, it's a total time capsule. Not only does it lay out all of his arguments, but it gives us some really juicy historical tidbits about what the Indian National Congress was promising way back when, promises that seem to have vanished. One of the things that really struck me was how Karunanidhi starts his speech. He asks this really provocative question. India got its freedom from the British, sure, but are the states themselves actually free? He even compares them to a prisoner who's been released from jail but is still walking around in chains.
That's a powerful image, is it? It gets right to the heart of the tension inherent in these federal systems. On the one hand, you need a strong central government to handle things like national defense and set overall economic direction. But on the other hand, you have states that want the freedom to address their own specific needs and their priorities. It's a balancing act. And finding that right equilibrium is never easy, especially in a country as diverse and complex as India.
Totally. And Karunanidhi doesn't just throw out this analogy. He backs it up with some hard facts. He points to the Indian National Congress's election manifesto from way back in 1945. They straight up promised a federal system with maximum freedom for constituent units and a limited list of things the central government would control. Sounds pretty different from how things actually shook out, right?
Right. And that raises some really interesting questions. Were those early promises about state autonomy, were they genuine? Or were they just some clever political maneuvering? In the lead up to independence, it's hard to say for sure, but what we do know is that the way federalism is interpreted and implemented can shift over time. Political winds change, new priorities emerge, and sometimes even the personalities involved can influence how power is shared.
Okay, but here's where things get even wilder. Karunanidhi even quotes Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister, from a 1947 resolution, where he flat out says that any power is not specifically given to the central government should automatically belong to the states. So what happened? Why didn't this vision of strong state autonomy become reality?
That's the million-dollar question. And there are a few possible explanations. One theory is that national unity was a huge concern in those early years. India was this brand new nation, incredibly diverse, and the leaders might have worried that giving too much power to the states would lead to fragmentation or even chaos. A strong central government could be seen as the glue holding everything together, especially during such a fragile period.
Just basically they were thinking, better safe than sorry, clamp down on the states now, worry about their autonomy later.
It's a plausible interpretation. Another factor might have been the economic situation at the time. India adopted a socialist model of development, which tends to favor a strong central government to manage key industries and direct investment. This might have contributed to the central government accumulating more power as time went on.
Makes sense. And let's be real, politics always plays a role, right? As the Congress Party got more and more powerful at the national level, maybe they just weren't so keen on sharing that power with the states, especially if those states were run by rival parties.
It's certainly a possibility. Power dynamics are always in flux, and it's naive to think that pure idealism always wins out. Karunanidhi himself doesn't shy away from this. He points out his own parties, the DMK's long-standing fight for state autonomy. He highlights points from their election manifestos, showing they've been consistent on this issue for decades.
And get this, he even calls out the central government for basically acknowledging the need for greater state autonomy by creating this thing called the Rajamana Committee, a group specifically tasked with figuring out how to give states more power. And then they completely ignore the committee's recommendations. What's the point of commissioning a report if you're just going to shove it in a drawer?
The Rajamana Committee is a fascinating piece of this puzzle. The fact that its recommendations were ultimately ignored is incredibly telling. It suggests that despite acknowledging the issue, the central government wasn't truly committed to changing the power dynamic. Perhaps they feared that giving states more control would jeopardize their own authority.
It's like they wanted to have their cake and eat it too, acknowledge the issue, but don't actually do anything about it. But I'm curious, what were some of the specific things the Rajamana Committee recommended? What kind of changes were they proposing?
Well, they had a whole range of suggestions. They proposed some pretty substantial shifts. The balance of power, for example. They recommended moving more subjects from the central government's list to the states list, giving states more control over things like education, agriculture, and even law and order.
Wow, that's pretty major. So
Yeah.
they were really going for significant devolution of power.
Exactly. They also suggested giving states more financial autonomy. They argued that states should have a greater share of tax revenues and more control over how they spend that money.
Makes sense. It's hard to have real autonomy if you're constantly having to beg the central government for funds.
Right. And this is where things get really interesting. Because the committee's recommendations weren't just about abstract principles of federalism. They were about addressing real-world challenges. They recognized that states were often in a better position to understand and respond to the needs of their citizens, especially in a country as diverse and geographically vast as India.
Okay, so we have Karunanidhi arguing passionately for state autonomy, the DMK backing him up, and even this official committee saying, hey, the states need more power. But despite all this, the central government basically just shrugs and says, no, we're good. Why so resistant to change?
Well, as we touched on earlier, there were concerns about maintaining national unity and stability. Some argued that giving states too much autonomy could lead to fragmentation, potentially even weaken India's position on the world stage.
But Karunanidhi would probably argue that true unity comes from empowering states to govern themselves effectively right. Kind of like if people feel like they have a voice and a stake in their own state's affairs, they'll be more invested in the success of the nation as a whole.
That's exactly the argument he makes. He emphasizes that states are closer to the people, they understand local needs and aspirations better, and they can be more responsive to the unique challenges faced by different regions. He even goes so far as to say that concentrating too much power in the central government can actually be detrimental to national unity because it can alienate people and create a sense of disconnect between the rulers and the ruled.
It's kind of like that old saying, think globally, act locally, but applied to government. But wouldn't there also be a risk of increased inequality between states if they had more autonomy? I mean, some states are already much richer and more developed than others. Wouldn't this just exacerbate those disparities?
It's a valid concern. Critics of increased state autonomy argue that it could lead to a situation where wealthy states get even wealthier, while poorer states fall further behind. They worry about a potential race to the bottom, where states compete to offer the lowest taxes and the least regulation in order to attract businesses, potentially harming workers and the environment. In the process,
it's almost like states could become mini countries, each with their own set of rules and priorities. And that could create a whole new set of challenges, right? Disputes between states, conflicting laws. It sounds like a recipe for chaos.
It's certainly a risk that needs to be considered. But proponents of state autonomy would argue that those challenges can be mitigated through careful planning, clear divisions of power, and mechanisms for cooperation and dispute resolution between states. They might point out that even within the current system, there are already significant disparities between states, and that greater autonomy could actually empower states to address those disparities more effectively.
So it's really a question of whether you think the potential benefits of greater state autonomy outweigh the risks.
Precisely. And there are no easy answers. It's a complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
So let's fast forward to today. Is this debate about state autonomy still relevant in modern India? Or is it just a historical footnote?
Well, it's absolutely still relevant. In fact, you could argue that it's even more relevant now than it was back in 1974. India's economy has transformed dramatically in recent decades, and states have become increasingly important engines of growth. They're competing for investment, trying to attract businesses, and they need the flexibility to create policies that work for their specific circumstances.
That makes sense. If states are expected to be economic powerhouses, they probably need more freedom to maneuver right. They can't be stuck following a one-size-fits-all approach dictated by the central government.
Exactly. And you see this playing out in all sorts of ways. There are disputes over the allocation of resources, with states demanding a greater share of tax revenues. You have calls for greater fiscal autonomy, allowing states to set their own budgets and spending priorities. And you see the rise of regional parties that champion state-specific interests, often challenging the authority of the central government.
It's fascinating how this speech from nearly 50 years ago still resonates so strongly today. It's a reminder that the tension between national unity and regional autonomy is an ongoing dynamic process. But what of Karunanidhi's main point? Was he right? Are states in India truly free? Or are they, as he put it, Prisoners freed from jail, but still bound by chains.
Well, that's a question that each listener will have to answer for
That
themselves.
really makes you think about what freedom really means.
Huh.
So where do you land on this? Are states in India really free to make their own choices? Or does the central government still have too much control?
Well, it's not a simple answer. India's federal structure is complex. There are good arguments on both sides. On the one hand, states do have a significant degree of autonomy. They have their own legislatures, they control important areas like education and healthcare, and they have a voice in national decision-making through the upper house of parliament.
So they're not totally powerless. They do have some wiggle room.
Right. But the central government still has a lot of influence, especially when it comes to things like money and national security. And as we've discussed, there's this history of centralization that still shapes how the center and the states interact.
So it's like a constant back and forth, states wanting more freedom, and the central government trying to keep things in check. But if you were designing India's federal structure today, knowing what we know now, where would you draw the line? More power to the states or strong central government?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I think the key is to find a system that allows for both unity and diversity. It needs to balance the need for national cohesion with the need for regional autonomy. Different states have different needs, different strengths, and different challenges.
You're trying to find that sweet spot, right, where states have the freedom to thrive and do new things, but without putting the whole nation at risk.
Exactly. And that sweet spot might change over time as India keeps developing and faces new challenges. What worked in 1947 or even in 1974 might not be the best solution today.
So it's an ongoing process, kind of like democracy itself.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so interesting. There's no single model for federalism that works everywhere. It's about finding the right balance. For a specific country at a specific time, who knows what the future holds? Maybe India will keep giving states more power, or maybe things will shift back towards a stronger central government. Only time will tell.
We started with this question from Karunanidhi about whether states in India are truly free. And after all this, all these historical facts and arguments, we still don't have a clear answer.
But that's the best part of learning. It's not about finding all the answers. It's about understanding more, challenging what we think we know, and really getting into the complexity of things.
For sure. So to wrap things up, let me leave you with one last question to think about. If you could rewrite India's constitution today, what would you learn from all this debate about state autonomy? What kind of balance would you create? It's something to consider, isn't it?